Okay, so this meeting is being recorded. Welcome. It's great to see so many people, especially this is the second Friday in a row. So welcome. I'm Phoebe Jackson. I'm a physics teacher at John Abbott College and a SALTISE fellow, and I'm the moderator today. Before we begin, just a reminder as always that when you leave, we'd appreciate if you just take 1 minute to complete the survey that Sue will post in the chat so we can keep providing you with resources that you need. Sue will put it in a few times throughout, and if you need it and you can't find it, just ask in the chat. So today is our first Renowned Scholar session of 2024, and we are very lucky to have as our first scholar this year, Dr. Cindy Hmelo-Silver from the School of Education at Indiana University, where she is the Barbara B. Jacobs Chair in Education and Technology, Distinguished Professor of Learning Sciences, and Director for the Center for Research on Learning and Technology. But that's not all, because when we say renowned, we mean it. Dr. Hmelo-Silver is an inaugural fellow for the International Society of Education and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Educational Research Association, and the International Society for Design and Development in Education. Having conducted significant research into problem-based learning, collaborative engagement, and the use of tech to support these approaches, Dr. Hmelo-Silver is currently the co-principal investigator on the NSF Institute for Engaged Learning. Today, Dr. Hmelo-Silver is going to share with us how problem-based learning has been integrated into a variety of contexts. As many of us know through personal experience, PBL, or problem-based learning, has the potential to offer our students more authentic and deeper collaborative learning in our disciplines and across disciplines. But we also know that it's not easy to implement. It's hard to make it work. So today, Dr. Hmelo-Silver will also help us better understand some of the challenges to teaching and learning through PBL, and we'll discuss some scaffolds for these challenges, including technological-based scaffolds. So the format today will be, if you have questions, you can type them in the chat. As your moderator, I'll keep an eye on them. And at the end of Dr. Hmelo-Silver's presentation, I'll bring your questions to her, and you can also ask them yourself if you prefer. And with that, here is Dr. Hmelo-Silver. I'll stop screen share now and you can take over.
Okay. Let me just get myself organized here for a minute. I don't think I've done this right because I didn't share the right screen. I'm going to stop. It took us a moment to do this before, so. Here we go. I'm going to share desktop too. Well, thanks to you all for having me here today. I'm honored to be part of this series and to be part of a series called Distinguished or Renowned Scholars. So thank you all for inviting me. I want to talk today a bit about what problem-based learning is. I want to talk about whiteboards and other representations because they're really useful in thinking about how you make PBL work. I would tell people I've spent a whole chunk of my career trying to figure out how to create a whiteboard that helps promote the same kind of collaborative activity that happens in a traditional, if one can call a problem-based learning classroom traditional. And then try to end with thinking about how do we have systems of support for both the instructors and for the students. I think I get there. I'm mostly going to talk the way through because I can't quite figure out how to see people at the same time I'm showing the slides. So I may take a little break and get folks to jump in after I show a video. But much of this work is, or at least the original work, was building a lot on work that happened in Canada, work that I was privileged to do with Howard Barrows, and I'm going to show you some examples of those which are been around for a while, as well as showing some examples of disciplinary adaptations. So let me start by talking about what is problem-based learning. Um, it's a student-centered pedagogy, meaning that what the teachers do should build on what the students are doing, where students learn by solving problems in small groups as they learn disciplinary content, skills, and practices, as well as developing critical thinking and problem solving skills, and helping support students become lifelong learners. Because one of the things that we hope is that they can work on problems that they don't know how to solve, but figure out what they need to solve the problem along the way. So some of the key components are the problem itself, that needs to be group worthy, that needs to be open-ended. I'll talk more about that. The tutorial cycle that provides some routines, the facilitation, which is really talks about the role of the teacher, how students engage in collaboration and the importance of reflection, and and um, then I will talk a bit about facilitation and different whiteboards. So let me get started. So the role of the problem in PBL is that it's the starting point. Ideally, it's a real world problem that students need to solve, and a good problem promotes student engagement, hopefully disciplinary engagement. It should be complex. It should be ill-structured, meaning there's multiple ways to solve the problem. There might not even be one right answer. They tend to be open-ended. And of course, what counts as open-ended may depend on learners' prior knowledge. And ideally, there should be some way to provide feedback on what the learners are doing, whether it's to an external audience, whether there's some kind of simulation. But ideally, there's some way of getting feedback. There are a lot of different kinds of problems that have been used in problem-based learning, PBL for short. Troubleshooting faults, diagnosis, making a decision, design problems. But I would also like to point out that some problems can also be disciplinary problems. And so in medicine, understanding a patient disease or coming up with a treatment plan might be problems. And I can give you good problems for educational psychology and learning sciences, but I think, what's a problem in English or in mathematics is going to depend on the discipline. And I will leave that there. But these complex problems need good systems of support. And one way to begin to have those systems is this tutorial cycle, which really provides a structure for problem-based learning. I'm hoping that figure is big enough, but in general, in most versions of problem-based learning, students start out by meeting a problem, some kind of problem trigger, analyzing the problem by identifying facts, generating some initial ideas or hypotheses about what might be a solution. They identify what they need to know and what they need to learn more about, and then go off, engage in some kind of self-directed learning. Among medical students, they go off and use various search tools. Among younger students, we might provide curated sets of resources. And then you want to bring the students back and have that they apply new knowledge to the problem. So the self-directed learning piece is probably the place where students go off individually and look at resources. But most of this is collaborative. They evaluate and reflect. Did they solve the problem? And reflection is actually missing from this picture, where they think about, what did they learn? And I'll talk more about that. So collaboration makes thinking public. It helps support students to learn together as they build collaborative explanations and solutions. It also makes some of these hard problems manageable as it distributes students' knowledge and as well as the expertise. So some students may know more about one aspect of the problem, or when they do their self-directed learning, they tend to divide up those things they need to work more about to be able to come back together. But it may need support. Students don't always necessarily collaborate well, so it may require things like distributing, giving students different roles or providing scripts. When there's small numbers of students, the facilitator provides a lot of that support. Again, things like scripts and roles become more important when you're in larger classes, which is what I'm assuming that most of you are. Finally, we always want to end a problem with reflection, which is really important for thinking about learning and transfer. It helps learners relate what they've learned to what they knew before, to their prior knowledge, to tie what they learned specifically in this problem to things that are more general, as well as to think about their strategies for learning, problem solving, and collaboration. But a key piece here is that the teacher serves as facilitator. They help guide and support the students, helping them identify learning objectives and developing problem-solving skills. And the teacher helps motivate and engage students throughout the process. But again, when you look at an experienced PBL group, an experienced facilitator, it doesn't look like they're doing very much. But I would like to share with you one of my favorite examples of a problem-based learning activity. And this is with Dr. Howard, the late Dr. Howard Barrows, who was one of the ancestors of problem-based learning. So here we've got some medical students working on a problem of a vitamin deficiency in a patient who presented with numbness in their hands and feet. And one of the students says, wow. And I want to show you then what, this will be a 30-second clip. So take a look at what goes on and what Dr. Barrows does and see what you think, why you think I thought this is such a cool clip. So we may make a brief stop after this. Whoops, except I need to get it to play.
Why do you say wow?
I just think that if it's our assessment to this point has been that she has numbness on the bottom of her feet. She just told us from her history that it's all the way up her legs now.
So what's that do for you?
I think the severity of it seems more to me. It's progressed very quickly up her legs.
Radiculopathy. What is that wonderful word?
I'm going to stop my share for a minute and see if you noticed anything or what you might have seen.
Cindy,
Yeah.
maybe you could give us the language that's being used. I mean, I know it's English, but
Okay.
I mean, we couldn't really hear the
Okay.
the speakers.
Okay. I'm going to go back then and I'll tell you what's going on. I don't know if I needed to do something so that it would share the.
It did share the sound. I think maybe it's just quiet for some people.
Okay. So let me go back to my, hang on, I need to get it to go back and share screen 2. Oh, interestingly, now I can see you all again, but that was brief. The student said wow and expressed surprise at a patient's symptom. And so Dr. Barrows goes in and says, what did this do for you? Why is that important? So first he notices that there was a surprise. So instead of letting the students go on, he stops and says, okay, let's slow down. what's going on here? And then after he asks why, one of the students starts explaining why. And at some point, the word radiculopathy comes up. And that's a big, long, very long word. And he ends with, oh, radiculopathy, what is that wonderful word? And he pushes the students to explain. So now maybe I will go on to my next slide, because here what's going on is that he's actually used quite a few of these facilitation strategies that we identified. So I will tell you that I spent several years studying the video from this, and I don't know if Southern Illinois Medical School still has these videos available for training, but he builds on the student discourse. And here he starts out by pushing the students for an explanation. So when the student starts talking about the numbness and this, that, and the other thing, he says, why is that important? And then when one of the students just throws out another term, as medical students will do, because they're trying to I think, play with new ideas. And so then he pushes the student to explain that, to see, do they know what they're talking about, or are they throwing words out? And often when the students don't have a good explanation for what a word means, it ends up being on the learning issue column of the whiteboard. So I'm going to move to that. I'm just looking to see if there's anything in chat there. And there is not, so I'm going to just go back. And so this is where I will start talking about the representations. So the whiteboard, this one is from an example from an engineering class when I was at Georgia Tech just a few years ago. And students were solving a problem about the Bhopal cyanide spill in India. And the whiteboard is used, and you will have seen it, I think, in the last slide as well. I think, no, sorry, in this slide where there's that whiteboard there. And again, here's one from the engineering class, but it's for students identify the facts, ideas, what they still need to learn, and then what they're going to need to do. And that helps remind students where they've been, where they're going, what they need to think about. It also gives them something to talk about. And that's one of the things that's been really interesting, because in all the problem-based learning classes that I've been in and participated in, whether it's the whiteboard or drawing some other kinds of representations, diagrams, and flowcharts, as the students negotiate what goes onto the whiteboard, what comes off the whiteboard, whether it's a physical whiteboard or a virtual whiteboard, the negotiation that goes on around that is really important. It helps structure the tutorial cycle. And for the teachers, you can't know what's going on in every group, but if you've got multiple groups that you can see where they're going, this can be hugely helpful in being able to facilitate in a larger class. And from there, I actually want to go to talking about problem-based learning in large classes. So the medical school model was one facilitator, 5 to 8 students. Nobody else can do that. In larger classes, so when I've used a problem-based learning model in a class of 30-something, which I know is probably still small for some of you, I use the floating facilitator model, where I wandered among the groups to see what was going on. They had their whiteboards around the room, and I could spin around the room and see who was making progress, who had nothing written down there, needed to go look, who was thinking about the wrong subject. And that was tremendously useful. You can also use peer facilitation. So I had little cards for whoever was the peer facilitator in a group to give them some ideas about questions they could ask. When I talk about scaffolding the facilitator, that's the large Post-it notes around the room for recording whiteboards, as well as technology tools. And I'll say a little bit more about that. In large classes, you may need to add more structure because you can't help everybody right on the fly. So thinking about mixes of small group and whole class discussions and group accountability through reporting to the whole class. Using problem-based learning doesn't mean you never do a lecture. So you might see what the students' learning issues are and decide that there's some mini lectures you might want to do or bring somebody in. But I think as you make changes to PBL model, it's just important to think, what do you gain and what do you lose? And I suspect that's a question we can come back to. Representations can help. So having the PBL cycle begins to give you a routine of what you're doing as you work through a problem. The whiteboard helps both in promoting that routine, in making thinking visible, and helping the teachers build on the student thinking. So now I'm going to show just two examples, one from educational psychology from well, I've been involved in both of these, but this is work that I did with Sharon Derry many years ago. We taught a problem-based educational psychology course. There were not a lot of the same tools we have now. We won't talk about how old this is, but first of all, we had a PBL cycle. We gave students some individual activities and group activities. So they were presented with a problem, they had a video that they could build the problem on, and we had some curated resources for them to use. They were told these curated resources were the starting point and they should use some outside resources. But here we called them the steps, and in the beginning, students had no idea what we were talking about. But by the second problem of the semester, they would start saying, when are our step 7s due? We had group accountability, but also individual explanations. We organized we had both individual tools for the students, and we had group whiteboards that they used for their group discussions. It was a hybrid model. We had some in-class activities as well as out of class, but we organized it. This was for pre-service teachers. So we organized it around a particular model of instructional planning called backwards design, where the whiteboard had several tabs. One was about what was worth learning. The second was about what would provide evidence that the students were meeting those objectives. And then only then would they start thinking about activities. Students could put in a proposal, and then both the other students in their group and the instructor could provide feedback on those things, and the students could modify it. There were some small challenges there that the students figured out ways around, like they couldn't track changes back in the day. And so they would write new notes so that we could keep the thread. This was all before Google Docs. There's things that would be easier to do now to create these discipline-specific whiteboards, but that was our solution a while ago. More recently, I've been working with Kehlani Craig in a large history class. So the Ed Psych class had 35 students. The history class had 93 students. So here, the goal was to help students see history as not just established fact, but to help them interpret sources with respect to context. And this initial work that Kehlani did was in the context of Black Death. So she rearranged the whiteboard into quadrants of possible answers, what we know and what we don't know, and then a research agenda, because she wanted both the what we know and what we don't know to feed into each other. So she wanted the students to initially brainstorm, then to improve and think about how the quadrants were related to each other. She really wanted them to think about citation and corroboration, about who the author is, what their purpose, where's the document fit, who was the audience. So she went her brainstorm, improve, and then go through the whole thing and complete it were part of her inquiry cycle for the 3 problem-based learning units they did over her semester-long history class, to help students get more nuanced in thinking about what they were doing. One of the, I have this, I know this is a very strange looking video from a 360 camera, but this is students who were in an active learning classroom at Indiana University. And this is when they were working on the initial set of brainstorming about potential hypotheses and what they know and what they didn't know. So she, at the time, she was trying to figure out what the best medium to use was, whether it was a physical whiteboard, big Post-it notes, or computers. And I'm not sure we had a clear answer on that, but that's why you see different pieces here. But the questions did become iteratively more complex over the course of the semester. So for her, the iterative process started with what single element was the most significant factor in response to the plague in the 6th century, and then asking about 2 interrelated elements, and then plague responses in 3 different outbreaks. So they got progressively more complex, and communicating some of the norms of disciplinary research. The other important thing about this was that as Kehlani Craig and her TAs walked around this room, whatever the students had on their whiteboards, let the teachers see what were they doing and which groups needed some additional support from the teacher. But it gave her and the TAs a sense of what was going on here. You could also imagine how you might fit some of this into a learning management system and think about dashboards. So when I talked about systems of support, there's what can we do to support the students directly with our representations and routines, and what can we do to support the teachers? So giving them visibility into what the students are doing. This is an example from a game-based learning environment. So it's a special purpose dashboard. But just looking in some of the things that might be available in the learning management system, you can find out about group participation and resource use and time on task. And that may tell you a lot about what's going on. You can create whiteboards in Google Docs that your students can be working collaboratively in, and you can create the kinds of forms that you want to use that would be appropriate for your discipline. But I also know this is hard. I've been doing this for a while, and it's hard to facilitate. Sometimes it's sitting on your hands, and sometimes it's figuring out when to ask a question and how to bring multiple groups together so that everybody can contribute. I know there's challenges about teacher and student beliefs about learning. I think it's easy to assume that if we don't teach it, if we do cover stuff, the students learn it, and if we don't teach it, they don't learn. And that's really can be challenging. Finding good problems is challenging. Again, what makes a good question that students get deeply engaged in? Matching problems to curriculum. I had a bunch of slides I could have talked about curriculum, but decided not to do that. And the physical setting, having a place where students can actually sit all looking at the same thing is really helpful. And I think with that, that's probably more time than I thought I would do. But hopefully that introduced enough that we're ready for, I guess Liz was gonna ask me questions.
Yes, we thank you, Cindy, for this this primer and all of these important parts of PBL that that go into making it work. So I know Phoebe's been collecting questions along the way, so I'm going to let her continue facilitating. Phoebe, do you have some questions to start, and I'll collect some more.
Yeah, we'll keep collecting. Everyone, please feel free. You can raise your hand too if you wish to speak yourself as opposed to having me read out your chat, but I'll do that. We maybe, I think the first question I see here in the chat was from Michael. And it was just a question about the whiteboards. Michael, do you want to ask it yourself?
Yeah, just wondering about, thinking about the implementation of the whiteboards, and you mentioned sticky notes versus dry erase boards versus I think you mentioned paper or something. I'm assuming the whiteboards are sort of meant to be dynamic in that, for instance, you put something in the needs to be learned column. Once you've learned it, that might actually have generated new facts that you're doing. So that would then be sort of a living document, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, in people you can move things, you can cross things out. I mean, that's what you have to do if you don't have something that's quite as dynamic. I've seen people also do Post-it notes where they've actually put Post-it notes on Post-it notes. I could imagine things like Jamboards, which are going away, but I think there's other tools that could be used for that. Most of the K through 12 teachers know all these tools. I don't as well, but I think absolutely they should be dynamic and be moving as you start to learn things. And also thinking about, are there places where you'd want to, have students pull together a concept map or a flow chart, or what other kinds of representations might you use to help reflect where the students are now and how they're putting things together.
Thank you. I mean, and I guess that serves a purpose apart from guiding the students, and also like in a large class environment. If these are sort of sufficiently public, that can really help from as a teacher managing that situation.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of marveled at Kaylani in that history class of 93 students, because when I had 35 students in Ed Psych, I had the whiteboards around the room when they were in class, and I would spin. Quite literally, I would spin around the room, and I knew it didn't take a lot of reading to know what was going on. And once you've worked with a problem a few times, you kind of know how the problem will behave and how the students will handle it. And so, for example, if I wanted to then have a whole class discussion, I knew sort of in order to call on groups to make sure everybody had something important to contribute.
Thank you.
That reminds me of so many active learning approaches, which is the second time is always better than the first. So you just kind of have to try it. Cindy, we had a question from actually Kathy. I see your camera's on. Can you ask that one?
Sure. I think it's a little bit on a similar bent to Michael, but I find that that it's difficult to bridge low tech and high tech learning environments. And I found that in COVID online teaching, it actually sort of almost facilitated certain things, because you could sort of manage multiple screens and multiple group work at the same time. So I tried to keep some of those activities, but then they don't work in the low tech, even in the low tech active learning environments, because like Michael said, it's you don't have this visible and then bringing the work from outside the classroom. So I don't know if you have ideas about how to sort of manage that continuity without, you know, being in the same kind of environment in and out of the classroom.
Yes, so I think there's a couple of things, and I'm sure I don't have a right answer. So let me just preface it with that. I think if you have a large monitor at the end of each group in an active learning classroom, that probably makes it easy, though. I think when we were in the history classroom, it felt like the students leaning over the paper also worked pretty well. I think that, but on paper, students don't like to revise stuff nearly as well. I think that relates to some of what Michael asked. So thinking about how do you get students to either set up shared workspaces for the students where they can be working in a higher tech environment, or having them have some way of recording, because they can take pictures and post that as an artifact. I think one challenge is to figure out what works for both you and for the students. So I'm just trying to think of what my thinking out loud here, that I think in so many ways it seems easier. For example, you could create a table for them to work in. It could expand, it could contract, they could all look at it, they could all edit it. But I do know when they're in the same room, if they don't have a display that they can all see, sometimes that's a little bit harder. And if they do decide they'd rather do it on paper, I think making sure there's a way that honors some of their choices. Because one of the things I have seen in problem-based learning is that making sure the students keep some ownership of what they're doing, but not to a fault to where, you know, you can't see what they're doing. I think I had, when I was teaching the Ed Psych course, I had one group of students that just didn't want to put all their stuff online, but then wanted to show me they were doing the work. And so they sent me a copy of their whole chat, which was actually not that useful. And I think that was a place where I said, but I need you to be doing something that looks sort of like what the rest of the classes do. So I don't know if that helps or answers your question. I think it's some of it is I don't have a good answer. But I think other people would tell you that some things are much harder when they're all online. I end up teaching the problem-based course as an asynchronous course, and I have to have the students do some of the activities online, and I actually find it harder. A synchronous class would be really different.
Yeah, I guess it's figuring it out. I guess we're all figuring it out together.
And you know what, sometimes you got to try it and see what works. And then it's all a revise and resubmit. I get everything, but I never get anything right the first time.
Liz, I know your hand's up. I just wanted to check with Beth first, because Beth, your question was kind of related to what was just being discussed. Did you want to chime in here?
Yes, I'm teaching a course right now, which is about 90% problem related, but it's been moved online. And I have students discussing in groups real life problems with real life community organizations as part of I'm continuing studies for McGill. And we consider that we also have a community, a duty towards supporting community organizations. And it's really tricky. I know there's a whiteboard feature in our learning management system, but I'm I don't know whether to go to the authorities and say, look, you can't do this online, when you need to bring the client into the classroom and have the students discuss in groups. And so you can't see what's going on. I can see that in the breakout rooms, the little microphones are going up and down. That shows me that they're talking, but you can't walk around. I don't know if anybody else has any suggestions for handling this sort of situation.
So one possibility that I would think of, you could set up, I mean, there's the whiteboards you can do in the learning management systems. There's the whiteboards you can do in Zoom. I don't know that you can bring the same whiteboard back up again in another session though in Zoom. But you could definitely create something for each group in a Google Doc that could be, what is it you want to have as a record of their activity, as well as a scaffold for their activity. So, what we see in a lot of K through 12 settings, and I meant to get a copy of one of those. I started and got distracted. These KWL boards. So what do we know? What else do we need to know? Which might be, what do we need to know from the client? And what have we learned so far? So, there's other ways to set that up. And, whether the columns are these generic columns, and I've had lots of people say, well, facts, ideas, learning issues, action plans, that's not meaningful for me, or I don't know what that means in my domain. So like in the Ed Psych class where we organized it around this backwards planning model, it helped remind the students of what they needed to think about for pre-service teacher education. So you could set up documents that are not necessarily in the conversation, but they could be shared documents that the students could be referring to as they're in their online class. Are they synchronous or asynchronous?
Both, mostly synchronous. Yeah, one of the things I've been doing is setting up a class exercise where we have a slide that I fill in, and I don't use the slideshow feature. I just keep the slides as is, and I type into them as the students make suggestions. And then when we take it up the next week, I bring up the slides as we completed them and post them on our LMS for later, so that at least everybody can see at the same time what people are saying and refer back to it. But it seems to me kind of clumsy.
Yeah, I mean, having like separate slides for different groups and having the groups present some of it, or?
No, this is done with the whole class together. I wouldn't try and go as far as having it for separate groups.
But you could have the groups do that and then try to have each group contribute some ideas that then end up on your master. I mean, that might be a way of doing that. And then you could see what they're talking about. I mean, that's the other piece, is that you may not be able to wander and hear all the conversations, but if they're all working on a slide, what you can do is actually pop from group to group to see what the slide is. And then you might be able to say, gosh, this, group 3 is just really struggling. I need to go sit there for a while.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
There are more questions, but I thought at Liz's good suggestion is maybe it would be just interesting to know, and for you too, Cindy, how many people attending at the moment have actually tried PBL? So maybe we can do a hand raise, like in the reactions. I mean, you can turn your camera on and raise your hand too if you like. So if I am reading the crowd right, it's not a lot of us. It's some. And so for some of us, this may be a new idea, which brings me to, let me see, there's other questions now. It brings me to a question that I had, and actually it came up in the chat too. Cindy, very early on, you mentioned English. which got me thinking, because I was recently talking with an English teacher about PBL. Michael, you were there too, and we were having trouble thinking about, although actually Michael doesn't have trouble, he gets very creative, thinking about what a PBL problem would look like in English in a subject. I mean, social science is not such a big stretch for a scientist to think to social scientists, but how do we think about something like English in the context of PBL?
So this is where you have to know the discipline. And that's something where I don't know the discipline well enough to answer, but I can give you another example from another discipline that I also don't know well. When I was teaching my PBL class years ago at Rutgers, one of the students wanted to do design a PBL for Chinese language Chinese students who were native Chinese speakers who were learning English. And I said, I have no idea what a problem would be. And what she had them do was take a traditional Chinese poem and perform that for their class, or for an elementary school class. I said, that is a really great problem, and I would never have thought of it. So I think one of the things but she was somebody who had taught English who had taught people who were learning English. So I think this is one of those things where your disciplinary knowledge is important in thinking about what's a good question. So Kehlani's questions in history were not what I would call the kind of real world problems drawn from the newspaper that I'll often use. But she used problems that are things that historians try to explain. I don't actually understand enough what people who, and I apologize to any of you who might be English teachers, but I don't understand enough what it means to be a scholar of English. But I think problems can include the kinds of scholarly questions we ask. I mean, I can think of problems, for example, that use math, but I can't think about if I wanted students to learn to think like a mathematician. I don't know what that would look like. I suspect it would have something to do with proof, but beyond high school geometry, I don't know that I could do that. Does that help?
Liz?
Sorry, two things. One is, the people attending, given that many people haven't tried PBL, I'm curious as to why they may not have tried it. I'm not asking them to reveal anything by answering, but it would be nice to put some things in the chat to see why there may be problems in implementing or trying it out. But I'm wondering, Cindy, for you, given some of the, I guess the tough question is there evidence to show, or sufficient evidence to show, that PBL does something particularly good for learning, that it makes it worth doing? And then after that, we can then discuss, like, what do we need to do to make it, adopted, if there's enough evidence?
Yeah, there's pretty good evidence. I think I'm trying to go find one of the presentations I pulled from earlier that we've got evidence. There have been a bunch of meta-analyses that provide support for problem-based learning in terms of content, in terms of collaboration skills, in terms of self-directed learning skills. The effect sizes vary, and it depends how you're measuring it. So generally you get, if you're just looking for multiple choice kind of recall kind of stuff, you don't see much of an advantage, but you don't see much of a disadvantage either. So I think that's actually important. But as you start looking at things that are at more complex kind of learning outcomes, you see advantages for problem-based learning. And it's not, I was pulling pictures from a couple of places, so it's not in my recent enough slides to actually for me to pull up the data quickly, but what was it? Andy Walker and Heather Leary have done some nice meta-analytic studies of problem-based learning. One of the challenges is that people don't always include enough detail on what exactly they're doing for problem-based learning. And I think one of the questions is how, how are people adapting it for their settings? And I think that's actually really important for your setting, for your discipline. What you're going to do in a class of 90 something is going to be really different for what you're going to do in classes where you've got somebody that's got a section with 5 students in it.
Yeah, I'm going to continue on with the questioning, perhaps, and just stop me, Phoebe, if there are questions in the chat. I think I see one from William.
You're
So
okay.
I'll
Keep
hold.
going for now.
Yeah, keep going. A question for sort of following up on that, Cindy, because I remember something from Wendy Newsetter from Georgia Tech, who I believe she was doing some research that showed that 2 things that were noteworthy about the impact of PBL. One was that students learned to do problem solving for decision making that they transferred to other contexts. So there was a long-term impact. And in her case, I think she was in the School of Medicine, biomedical engineering, actually. And I think she was saying something that, like, employers like to see students who go through PBL because they're better thinkers than students who go through traditional ways of learning. Has that been your experience in the studies you've done, in the work that you've seen other people do?
So I don't know that there's that kind of evidence from employers. I don't know that anybody's collected that kind of data. And one of the challenges is always that we don't do these long-term studies. I mean, in medical school, there's been some evidence that there's more, even in places where there's not as much initial learning on factual kind of recall, the medical students remember more a year later. But I don't know that we've got that kind of evidence about what employers say. And again, there's not a lot of places where where you've got that whole curriculum. Some of the, for example, collaboration and teamwork are the kinds of things that I think are harder to develop in a shorter period of time, where, like, for med students that may do this for 2 years of medical school, they've got practice. I think one of the Southern Illinois, at one point, they took a whole freshman year curriculum and they got, I think, 4 professors that collaborated to create this whole problem-based first year curriculum for students. I don't know what they found about their learning outcomes. But I think it took, I mean, here, when you've got a whole year, I think that's where you begin to have the opportunity to see some of those kinds of things.
Yeah, thanks, because it really does come back down to what's the cost benefit, right? So it costs a lot of time. It takes a lot of practice from the instructor and all the things that you pointed out. But it seems like intuitively, it should be doing something really beneficial, even if you're using it, you know, only in a single course. So the what is it that it could be doing? You know, it's always been that question for me. I don't know about the other people in the room, like, you know.
Yeah, I think there's also different ways to use it. So when I was an assistant prof, they, I think maybe because my lecture ratings were pretty awful, I managed to double my teaching ratings. And so people, you know, I said at the outset, I'm only covering 80% of what everybody else is doing. And that may sound radical, but that's also this assumption we have about coverage and learning. But I think there's also different ways to think about it. So in Craig's large history class, she didn't do the whole semester PBL. She did 3 PBLs through the semester that built on each other. So, you know, again, that's where you think about trade-offs. So, you know, if we want to develop teamwork skills and some of the kinds of thinking skills that are not going to happen in a 1 semester course, that's a trade-off. But if we want to introduce students to historical thinking, doing 3 PBLs over a semester is probably a good way to do that, to let them at least have a sense that it's not just what you read in the textbooks. I also think you can use PBL to start a unit off. You know, there's been some work, Dan Schwartz's work on time for telling, and work on productive failure. You can have students work on some really hard problem for a little bit, you know, give them a day or two, have them generate some artifacts that tell you where the students are. And then they're also much more ready to hear a lecture, and they get much out of it. And there's some pretty good evidence on that. So, you know, thinking about, it's not, Howard Barrows would have disagreed with me, but, you know, it's not all or nothing, and it doesn't mean you never do a lecture, and it doesn't mean that has to be the only activity in your course. But for example, if you want to use it to start sections of a course, or to deepen thinking, or just to prepare students for what they're going to learn, I think there's options there. And again, I'm sure not everybody would agree with me, but I'm okay with that.
William.
Hi, thank you. My apologies if I sound redundant. I had like something in the middle and I came back, but I just wanted to ask you how you personally kind of adapted to this type of teaching. So I'm at the ISON, so I teach nursing. I'm a nurse, that's my profession. We teach inquiry-based learning as pedagogy for the application of the clinical reasoning cycle, which is essentially how a nurse thinks. And then we introduce students to critical care also as like an entry point for them. So there's a bit of a double challenge in that way, but the students have been exposed to IBL prior. So it's not like if they're learning it on the spot. My thing is, I was trained in a didactic manner. From 2008, I graduated. So it was theory courses, large courses, big exams, etc., mixed with clinical experience to try and consolidate this knowledge. And now I'm teaching in a completely different way. So my brain is wired in a way that I have certain expectations out of what I'm teaching, but it's almost like how I evaluate how I teach and what is taught. There's some form of dissonance between like, am I doing this right? One, I never feel good at the end of the class for some reason, because it's so dependent on the engagement, the group you have in front of you sometimes. And I have a hard time like getting feedback and saying, okay, you know what, it's a process. It's getting over the emotion really of it's a process, it'll be a long-term thing. It's hard to, I don't know, I don't feel like, you know, you don't go do a good job at the end of a class, or, oh, this was great, I learned something, and you leave class feeling great, like you had a great time teaching. It's quite of it's a long term in that perspective, I feel sometimes. But then there are some comments that come years later, because I've done this a few times, as feedback for the alumni of the program to a program director, and they said what they remember is IBL in the end. So, and it's helped them. I really didn't get much more information on the how and the what. It's like this, it's just an inherent, like implicit thing, not an explicit thing. It's like the way they practice it, they've internalized it somehow, and they can't express it, but they say it's helped. So I'm kind of working on that. But how did you kind of come to terms with that? Like, what kind of strategies or any type of little measurements or things like that said, yeah, no, this is happening, it's going well. Like, even if it doesn't feel good, it's going well anyways. Like, sorry, it's long-winded, but it's just, I can't.
That's okay. So I will tell you, I was a respiratory therapist in my first life. And I actually loved all the basic sciences courses, and I did really well in all of them. And we lost something like 30% of our class flunked out. So,
Sounds like
we took, yeah, we took some of our courses with the medical students and the dental students. I loved all those classes, but we lost a lot of people. You know, everybody was not me. My best semester as an undergraduate was the semester we took 22 credits. And I think when I was at Georgia Tech, I gave a talk to a bunch of graduate students in engineering, and they said to me, you know, we all learn traditional ways. Why do anything else? And I said, look around the room and look who's not here. So but it's uncertain. You know, like if you cover something, you know you covered it. You don't know that students learned it though. That's what I said about one of the barriers is your own beliefs about learning. And I think there's you know, you can do check-ins, you can do exit tickets, you can, you know, have those whiteboards that show you where the group is, and that helps you figure out where to intervene. Or, I mean, when I covered 5 big ideas when I taught the Ed Psych course, and I did one lecture in between each one because we needed a little bit of a rest, frankly. We needed a rest. I needed time to grade what the students put in between problems, because what I had the students do to help me know what they did was to write individual explanations or dissents from what their group did. It had to be principled and pull in their psychology principles, but I had them do that so that I knew that the individual students were taking something away as well. I had the artifacts of, I think when I moved, I had piles of these giant Post-it notes that I was never going to get back open because they were all folded up. So, you know, I think having students do individual reflections or justifications of what the group did is another way to give yourself some sense of what ideas they felt were important, that they learned, that they need, you know, to learn more about. At the beginning of the semester, I gave them a list of all the learning objectives. I didn't tell them when they were going to get them, but I said, you should learn most of this by the end of the semester. They had a textbook. I didn't tell them what to do with it. The students used the index and the table of contents to help generate learning issues. You know, I think about when I was, I loved all those basic science courses. And then I taught respiratory physiology. So I taught in a respiratory therapy program. And it wasn't problem-based, but I had one very inquiry-oriented activity that the students loved, that I really liked doing. And I had this notebook with problems where the students interviewed me individually, and I kept like expanding on them each year. So, but I had fairly small groups. And again, we lost a lot of students. So I think, you know, how do you engage the students, but also how do you figure out, you know, what are they taking away? But I think there's ways you can do checkpoints, and especially in larger classes where you don't have that kind of intimate knowledge of what people are doing.
I'm sorry to interject if someone else wanted to ask a question, but my question regarding that, I think, is because it's such a, for a professional program, let's say like respiratory therapy, nursing, it makes sense because it is an application of something. We have our theory, and that's what we're pretty much probably missing when we studied. And then if we had that added component, maybe the people that left would have probably stayed because they can see the use of that theory, which is great. But now my issue is there evidence as to how large or what are the limitations for this type of teaching learning with the numbers you have in front of you? Like my section, I coordinate 5 sections, and there are on average 30 to 35 students each section, because there's 100, and so, but it's within less than 2 hours each, and the subject matter is quite large. So is there an ideal, like they say, okay, groups of 6? I tend to see that groups of 5 is a good number when it comes to this, and then as soon as you hit 6, there's like this dysfunction that happens. Is there evidence that demonstrates like an ideal number type of thing, class-wise, group-wise, to kind of just really maximize everyone's role and try to limit the kind of the surfers that are in there a little bit?
So when I taught at psych, I like 5 in a group. That actually gives you some redundancy, and students can usually a group can usually handle 1 slacker, and this is purely anecdotal. Can usually handle 1 slacker. 2, it gets to be harder, but you know, 3 is almost critical mass to collaborate. But I found in teaching a section of 35 that it was hard for me to manage much more than 6 groups or 7 groups. I couldn't manage more than that. So, and again, I didn't have for the in-class stuff, because we did a hybrid. And so I think it's figuring out what gives you visibility. If you've got, I mean, if you're teaching all those sections, is there a TA in them, or you're not teaching them all yourself at the same time?
No, we're 5 facilitators, so no, there are no TAs, and we're overlapped. And within the curriculum, there's simulation as well. So like it's quite it's a case that's spread over a few weeks.
Okay.
So yeah, it's fun. It's just, it's like in the auto evaluation aspect. Like I want to know, like, if there's something that maybe environmentally is not good, or is it like a human factors thing where there's like too many people, or is it me, maybe there's something my way of facilitating is not necessarily probably connecting with them in the group. So it's just, there are so many variables for me, and I'm the type of person that I've been trained that way, I guess, is to find the cause, but there are so many factors that I don't necessarily control, but I can't. So I go into this like odd spiral while I'm doing this, and reading the crowd is sometimes the feedback, the nonverbal kills it a little bit too. And it's, how do we get them back? Like, even if the subject matter is interesting to all of us, everyone's in and out differently at different times, I guess. Yeah, I guess it's probably, I'm maybe overconscious of what I'm doing, and it's probably one of the reasons, but I just want them to have a good experience, like, and a good learning experience. So yeah, so sorry about that.
That's
Yeah.
okay. I'm going to respond to that, and I think respond to some of what I see in the chat. So there's always a dud group. I don't know what to do about the dud group. I probably shouldn't say it that way, but there's always, I mean, I can tell you there's the group that has just nobody who's interested. They're the group that don't understand what the crazy professor is doing, that really want to have knowledge poured into them, and that just don't want to play. And if you have a bunch of those in the same group, you have a dead group, or somebody who's on a sports team and is away a lot. So I wish I had an answer to that. You know, we're on some of my projects where we're using games to do problem-based learning. We're trying to figure out how AI can help support collaboration. the issues in K through 12, I think, are different than with college students. So I think that's where you try to figure out what tools tell you what's going on in the group. Was it Phoebe who said it's also sometimes the opposite is it feels like the group is doing a lot and then it turns out they're not. And this is where if you have something that lets you see what's going on in the group is really important, because that's when you can intervene and facilitate. I mean, when I taught Ed Psych and had the 6 groups, my triage was pretty much, I did my spin around the room, or I do my spin through whatever electronic tools I've got. And then I can say, okay, these 2 groups are doing well. They want to hear from me that they're doing well. Howard would have never done that. But I go and tell them, you guys are doing great. Keep it up. I love what you're doing. And go to them. I look at the group that has absolutely, seems like they're sort of going on a garden path, and I remind them what class they're in, or I can ask them to read some of the problem statement and some of the material for the problem and ask them if they know what something means that I'm pretty sure they don't. Because that will get them moving in a direction. And I see, would seed my problems with technical language so that I could go ask them, what does this thing mean? And if they don't know, it becomes a learning issue. And then there's a group where nothing, well, there's the dud group. I'll come back to them. Then there's the group that actually looks like they're working hard, but they're writing something. They look like they're talking. And that's the group I usually sit down with, because they're making a really good effort, but they seem stuck. The dud group, I try to make those efforts with, but there's just always one group that won't play. I have no idea what to do about them.
I have questions in the chat. Liz, do you want to go first, though?
I was going to take you to something you just said, Cindy, about using games and using AI, and if that's going to take us away from the direction of the chat, we can hold on to that question.
But I would love to answer it when we get through the
Okay, well, I'll just come back to Ricardo's comment here. Ricardo said, actually, Ricardo, are you there? Do you want to say it yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, yes, I just wrote, I truly believe in the depth of engagement and active learning that PBL fosters. In your experience, are there specific situations or learning objectives where incorporating additional methods like direct instruction alongside PBL could further enhance the student experience?
Yeah, I think so. Like, I mean, I certainly, I've mentioned the idea of PBL as a starter for a unit, and then preparing students to hear a lecture. I think that's different from using a case to illustrate, because here you let students actively engage in a problem-solving activity first, and doing small group work. And I think then they are ready for that lecture, specific topics. I think some of that is going to depend on the discipline. The example I gave of doing the poem as a problem-based learning, I couldn't have imagined how you would do PBL in a language course. But I think using it to start off and then having a lecture seems reasonable. Can you start off with something that's a more text-based problem that could lead into a more hands-on kind of investigation? I would think that would be. So what I think we don't know, and people would love to have arguments about, is, how do we sequence these different kinds of learning? When I added the lecture on the 5 on 5 big ideas between my PBLs and Ed Psych. Some of it was, it also just was a good opportunity to allow a check-in. So, you know, if students wanted to tell me they understood it really differently from what I was talking about, we could do that. I'm not sure that completely answers your question, but
That's a thumbs up from Ricardo.
okay.
So that's great. Thank you. Liz, that brings us to you.
Yeah, so Cindy, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this. I think this is a really nice flow, by the way, between what Ricardo was asking, some of the chat that I'm scanning, and what you said about bringing in games or a game approach to enhance your PBL, and what you just said about how do we sequence these kinds of learning activities to make them flow and make them actually work. That's really fascinating to us.
So actually, I mean, the game-based learning piece has been harder than I thought it would be, partly because the technical stuff is hard. And we're trying to do things, take things that were originally developed for single player as multiplayer. And we started doing that work before generative AI, and we actually didn't have funding to do natural language processing. So I'm not sure I have a great answer, but I think some places where generative AI can help is thinking about developing problems. That's a place where it could help. You have to know something about prompt engineering, which I am apparently not very good at. So I think it can help you develop tasks. It can also, if you have students working in, I'm looking at Zoom and I see AI Companion. I know in Teams with Microsoft Copilot, if you have a meeting in Teams, it'll summarize the meeting for you. You could imagine that some of these tools could help provide summaries of what's going on in groups. So maybe you can't be in 6 different groups, but if you can get a summary of what went on, it might not help you in the moment, but it might help you plan for the next day. With good prompt engineering, you could probably even search those summaries of, you know, our students talking about such and such ideas, or tell me which groups have not talked about it. So I think those are some places. What I think is really interesting, so when we did the work in Ed Psych, we developed special purpose tools. The issue of having multiple people and editing the same document was just not possible at the time. We worked around that and found some pretty good solutions, but so I think where technology is today, there's lots of general purpose tools that, and I think ChatGPT and some of the generative AI are those things. I think we do have to have lots we need to worry about, though, in terms of making stuff up, and issues of privacy and bias. So there's all kinds of ethical issues, but there's at least some potential there for summarizing and helping. I mean, because one of the challenges for doing inquiry-based learning or problem-based learning, and I tend to be a lumper, so I'm happy to think about those as a family, is thinking about how do we know what's going on in all these groups? How do we figure out how to allocate our limited facilitation resources? Are there places where the technology can directly support students? So can we, in some of our work, we are trying to train conversational agents in the game to support collaboration. So I like to think about what is it we can do to help students directly, and what are the things that we can do to help you, the instructors, because humans are the best adaptive support we've got. And if we can think about how do we provide what we can do with the machines, but can we give information to teachers in ways that are actionable, that are not overwhelming? Because it's really easy. Jim Slaughter was telling me he did some work with a dashboard where the teacher just like kept looking at the dashboard and not at the class. And I can imagine that, you know, as we're all walking around with our phones in front of our faces all the time. So, you know, remembering to look around at what's going on.
Michael.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. Sort of something said earlier has been sticking in my mind, and I'm sort of, oh, I got to try that next semester, which is the sort of using it in a context of a productive failure a situation, and I think that's a very interesting pairing. In that one of the problems I've had, with implementing PBL is not really getting the match between the problem and the class right. One group will go with it and awesome, and the rest of them will find sort of a very generic but uninspired solution, and that doesn't really. I was hoping for a little bit more or whatever, but it would seem maybe providing, and I think of it as a productive failure thing, like here's a normative way of approaching this sort of after they've struggled with it a little bit, as sort of a checkpoints throughout the project. I'm just wondering if I'm going in a bad direction, or is this
I think that sounds absolutely reasonable. I think also having students compare, I mean, whole class discussions in these larger classes are important too, because you can have groups compare their solutions. Manu and I did a chapter, Manu Kapoor and I did a chapter together. So he's the guy who developed all the productive failure stuff on learning through problem solving that was in the Learning Sciences Handbook we did in 2018. And, you know, I think Manu had a piece that looked at like models for productive success, which he put PBL in, and productive failure, which is what he does. And then there's unproductive success and unproductive failure. So I think the question is, how do you get everybody into one of those productive quadrants? And I think whether it's providing normative solutions, comparing, and then providing a normative solution, because you can imagine that you do also want to find a way to help students see that something they did mattered and help them move forward. But if you know what's going on in the class and have some way, I mean, I know I fuss about these representations, but the knowing what's going on is tremendously helpful. And a practiced eye doesn't have to look that hard, you know, especially at a group artifact. Individual reflections are a different story, but when students are writing stuff for a group, it tends to be much shorter and bulleted. And so, yeah, I think that absolutely makes sense. I think productive failure, preparation for future learning, problem-based learning, inquiry-based learning, I think they have lots in common. I think what's probably most important in those is that you start out having people work on a problem before either they find you or you provide information in some format.
Great. Thank you. A lot to think about. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right. We do have some final questions, but I just want to remind everyone that Sue has posted the survey throughout, but I think she'll probably post it again for us. So before you do leave, because we're getting close to the end here, or maybe after you leave, but remember to grab the link to the survey so you can complete it. It really does just take 1 minute. There it is. Wait, is that it? Is that the right one? Okay. The link
Yes.
looks longer to me.
It is.
So Cindy, as our final question, and maybe it's stepping down a level here with the question, but it is useful for us to help think about all these different approaches that are kind of floating around in the active learning sphere, to better understand the difference between some of the types of approaches. So we have problem-based learning, and then we also have case-based learning. And then I'm going to throw project-based learning in there too, because I find that one, like even the acronym gets me confused with PBL. And to add to that, in 3 minutes or less, also the difference between collaboration and cooperation and how that can play out in PBL as well.
So case-based learning is kind of a generic way of talking about using cases. Cases can be used to illustrate a point, they can be used as an example. It's not clear what the students have to do. There's not necessarily a signature pedagogy. There could be, but I think as it's often used, there's not a particular set of routines and scaffolds that are built in. So I think that would be one difference. It's not that case-based couldn't be in this family, but I think the having some kind of a cycle and scaffold, I think is where I start to draw the line a little bit. So that was the first part of the question, but
I also threw in project-based learning. That's my own personal question.
Project-based learning can have some of the same characteristics as case-based learning, but like if you do, I think Buck Institute has a particular model of project-based learning, and Joe Krejcik does this project-based science that's driven by a driving question. And I think in both of those, there are inquiry cycles and scaffolds that are built in to help create routines, to help create supports. So I think there's sort of different versions of project-based learning, and there's people who will call a lot of things problem-based learning. And so I think whenever you describe what you're doing, what's probably important is to say, so what are you doing? What kind of problem are you using? What kind of, routines and cycles are you using? What kinds of scaffolds are you using? And, what does it mean for it to be a student-centered pedagogy? Case-based learning is not necessarily a student-centered pedagogy. Problem-based learning, my answer is also, it depends. It depends on what model is being used.
Thanks. And I do see that it's 4 o'clock, so people are going to have to start leaving. The final question was about collaboration, but maybe we could just.
I can answer that quick.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Generally, collaboration is people working together, and cooperation is divide and come back together. That would be my distinction. But
and do you find in PBL groups cooperate a lot? And should we be encouraging collaboration more, or is divide and conquer what we want sometimes?
So collaboration is what you want in the discussions. I think when students go out and do individual learning issues and bring resources back to the group, you want a little bit of divide and conquer there. I've tried to do redundant divide and conquer though. So if somebody is sick or somebody is slacking off, that you have some redundancy in your groups.
Excellent. Thank you. And there's been more chat going on, but I think we are good for questions. Well, we have to be because it's 4:01. So Dr. Hmelo-Silver, I want to say thank you on behalf of all of us. That was really interesting and inspiring. And I feel like personally, I need to give PBL another try. And as you can see in the chat, there's some agreement there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cindy. This is wonderful to hear all of these stories from someone who's been there and been part of creating what we now call PBL. I think that's the part that I find always important about this renowned scholar series is that we're hearing it from the source. Which is often not the case, with practitioners. We hear it trickle down from books and and articles and rewritings of, what you've studied. So thank you so much for preparing this for us. Greatly appreciate it.
You're most welcome.
And thanks to everyone for
you.
coming on a Friday afternoon. I think it's the weekend now, right?
Yeah, we can stop the recording.
Give or take a